8.5 years ago. That is a long time. I was still in my 30s 8.5 years ago. Don't get me wrong, I still look great, but 8.5 years ago, Sony introduced the 85GM 1.4, and now, today, they are finally updating this lens. This is the 85 1.4 version 2, and my goodness, smaller, lighter, better autofocus, better in every single way. Is it worth upgrading if you have the original 85? The answer is yes. So, as you might assume, in my opinion, this is the best 85mm lens that you can possibly buy for the Sony E-mount system as of today. It is a wonderful lens, and I want to thank Sony for sending this out pre-embargo. It is just a loaner. I do have to send it back, which is too bad. Come on, Sony, help a brother out, right? You're a big company. You could throw me a lens once in a while, but I'm sending it right back. I do appreciate the chance to get to test it out for a few weeks, and of course, to convince myself that I need this lens in my life, and I will be purchasing this 85mm G Master version 2 lens. But the first thing you're going to notice when you pick up this lens is how much more manageable it is to hold and have on your camera. The version 2 comes in at 642 grams, and the older version is 820 grams. It is also much bigger and more bulbous in your hand or on your camera. The new GM2 is much more in line with the other Sony lenses, the GM versions and the G versions that you have come to expect. It's built amazingly well. It does, however, share the same 77mm filter thread, but the area around the actual glass elements is much smaller, so it looks like it has a smaller filter thread, but in fact that is an optical illusion. It features 2 focus hole buttons now, as opposed to the one of the original, and it also now has an iris lock. So if you want to lock your aperture in to automatic mode or manual mode, now you have a little switch to do that. Of course, it has a wonderfully turning aperture ring with very satisfying clicks when you are on click mode. You can also declick it to make it smooth if you are using video. The focus ring is really smooth and well dampened, and it's also a linear focus ring. So when you are in manual focus, you can now repeat focus pulls with this linear focus ring. It is a weather sealed lens, but Sony is careful to say that it is not guaranteed to be 100% dust and moisture resistance. I guess they want to cover their butts, legally speaking, that is, but I will say I would have no trouble taking this thing out in the elements. Ruggedly built, seems very well sealed to me. It comes with a push-button lens hood with a little rubber seal right around the front, and I love that because if you want to turn your camera and your lens upside down, it will balance very nicely on that little piece of rubber and the circular lens hood. It's the same type of lens hood that you will find on the original G Master. In terms of performance, this lens performs brilliantly, as you might hope, for their best 85mm lens, but it is remarkably sharper than the original GM. And this is a sharp lens. If you were just looking at the pictures of this lens in a vacuum, you would think a very sharp lens. But when you compare it side by side to the GM2, you will notice a big difference in sharpness. Here I will put up the most handsome model that you will ever see, and you can see from my gorgeous eyelashes here how much sharper the GM2 is versus the GM1. I was a little taken aback at how much more sharpness they put in, and not just in the center of the frame, corner to corner, even stop down to 1.4, you will see the corner sharpness much better on the GM2. And the version 2 is not just sharper than the original, it is sharper than any other Sony lens that I have tested. And I have heard the same thing from several people over at Sony, that this very well may be the sharpest lens that Sony has ever produced, and that is saying something. So that is wonderful news. If you are a portrait photographer or you like the 85mm focal length, then even on something like an A7R5 with that 61 megapixels, you will get such amazing sharpness. You can just punch in as much as you want, and it absolutely looks great. If you don't want that ultra sharp look, you can always take that down in post, but it's always best to start with the sharpest image possible. It is sharp, just cut myself right there. And another big improvement is with the autofocus. The original GM was no slouch, but now with these new XD linear motors, this thing can do everything. So it's up to 3 times faster in the regular autofocus modes and up to 7 times faster when you are trying to track a moving subject. And in my tests, that worked out to be true. You get much more keepers when something is running at the camera with the new version versus the original 85 GM. And this can also keep up with the 120 frames per second of the A9 III. So if you want to shoot fast, like a lot of people like to use an 85mm for sports. They get on the sidelines there in a basketball game and then they fire away with that A9 III. You'll be able to keep up now with this 85mm GM version too. So not only does the autofocus perform better, it's also much quieter. It is virtually silent on the new 85 version 2, whereas the original, you definitely hear those gears turning, and this one, so quiet, so discreet. I really like that. Nice and smooth when you're getting your autofocus. They've also improved chromatic aberration, so when you are pixel peeping now, you are not going to find any chromatic aberration to speak of on the new lens. You will see a little bit on the older lens, so in very high contrast scenes, you can certainly see. So when you look at this branch right here, you see how sharp it is, first of all, compared to the old version, but you can also see that magenta and that green color there on the original version, right there on the tree branch, and that is not present on the new one. And that is also great news for the specular highlights. And here we'll go back to our gorgeous model photo, and on the shoulder, the very muscular shoulder of our model, you can see a little bit of that chromatic aberration on the original lens, whereas the new one, it is not there. Now, something Sony couldn't eliminate entirely is the longitudinal chromatic aberration. That is the foreground that is out of focus and the background that is out of focus. When you see different color casts on those, that's a longitudinal chromatic aberration. I did still expect to see some because it's very hard to remove at this focal length 85mm, but it is markedly better than the original version, and the color shift is not as dramatic as well, so it is less noticeable even though it is there. When it comes to focus breathing, Sony says the GM2 is better than the original, but I don't see too much difference. The GM2 may be slightly better when it comes to focus breathing, but I think they are pretty comparable. I wouldn't buy the new one based on focus breathing alone. And when you're in video, remember, you can use focus breathing compensation on both lenses. So both lenses are compatible with those new Sony cameras that have the focus breathing compensation right in there. So if you want to do video and you want to completely eliminate focus breathing, turn that setting on, and there you go. But I think overall, pretty similar when it comes to focus breathing. What about flare and ghosting and Sunstars? Both lenses are really good in this regard. Even the original has still great coatings from Sony, so you're going to get a lot of contrast and you're not going to get any crazy flares. The new one is still better in this regard. It has more contrast and even less flaring and slightly nicer Sunstars in my opinion, but both lenses do really well in this category. With the bokeh, once again, this is a G Master lens, so you get amazing bokeh back there. The out of focus backgrounds are so smooth, so creamy, so pleasing, as the YouTubers like to say. And when it comes to the bokeh balls, if you have some fairy lights out of focus, you will see that the new G Master version 2 is slightly better than the already almost perfect G Master 1. When you look at the edges of the bokeh balls, you will see a little less color fringing on the GM2, but honestly, I would take the bokeh coming out of either of these lenses all day long. In terms of pricing, I am happy to say I just received an email. That's right, I get emails from Sony confirming the price is $17.99 USD, which is the same price as the original 85 GM. Love to see that. Announce a new lens, but don't hike the price. Good job, Sony. So in conclusion, if you are looking for the most optically perfect 85mm focal length, then right here, this GM version 2. Other than a little bit of LOCA, there are no optical flaws on this guy, and it's also much smaller and lighter, balances better on your camera, easy to take around. An absolute winner, what you would expect from a GM update, and that's what you got here with this lens. So Sony, thanks very much for sending this out so that I could review it, and I appreciate you people watching to the end, and we'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.